In this lesson, we'll learn how we can generate meshes around our hybrido particles. Okay, so in this scene, I have a simple little hybrido container that's been set up. You can see I have some hybrido particles that are splashing around. So what we'd like to do in this lesson is learn how we can start to generate meshes around these types of particles. So in our previous lesson, we looked at our standard mesh type. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the grid mesh. Now the grid mesh is primarily meant to be used with these hybrido particles, although technically you could use any kind of particles together with this grid mesh. So let's go ahead and drop this in. And you can see here's our grid mesh, and if I expand this, here's our domain. Now again, if we had multiple domains in here that maybe we wanted to be contained underneath the same mesh, we could just right-click and insert emitters and choose as many domains as we want. Now really the basic premise of this is very, very similar to what we looked at in our previous lesson. So to actually build a mesh, what we could do is either right-click on the mesh and go to Build, or what we could also do is select the actual domain itself, and if we expand the Surface tab, we can actually start to govern some of these controls in here as well, and we do have a Build Grid Meshes button in here. Now, you will find some of these overall settings quite a bit different from some of the standard particle mesh options that we looked at in our previous lesson. So let's first just start by selecting our grid mesh, and I'll set this to just a smooth shaded view. So if I select the mesh itself, you can see really only a few very, very basic options to be found in here. The mesh and the filters, as well as a couple other minor options. But really the primary attributes that we are going to have to adjust to actually control the look of this mesh is going to be found in the actual domain itself. So again, if I select the domain and expand the Surface tab, this is really where all of the settings that control the actual mesh will be found. So in my case, you can see right now that this mesh comes out very, very stair-stepped. So we have really very, very high loss of detail. So this is controlled by this detail threshold. Now by default, this is actually set up to a little bit higher value. So the default value for this is 0.2. So once again, if I were to build the mesh, you can see that actually now looks much, much better. So essentially what this is doing is just looking at the grids that these particles are based off of, and then just sort of using that as a basis for generating this particular mesh. So really, with this detail threshold, what you'll find is as we start to take this down to some very low values, you'll start to find that we get, again, a much more pronounced stair-step pattern as we start to get closer and closer to 0. So you can start to see, again, this starts to become much, much more pronounced. But on the other side, if we start to take this detail threshold and begin setting this up too high, as we start to get closer to 0.5 and 1, you can start to see that while this is much, much smoother, you can see we start to lose a lot of the contour and a lot of the overall shaping that we were getting with these particles. So typically I find that the default value of 0.2 actually is a really, really good starting point for most situations. Now below this we have our cell size. Now this is really what you can think of as, again, just being sort of the resolution of your mesh. So right now you can see if I were to select this, we're at about 53,000 faces. And you can see roughly about the overall resolution of my mesh here. So if I were to set this auto cell size to off, now we can come in here and start to actually define my own resolution. So if I were to set this to something like 0.5, and once again, rebuild, you should now see that if I select this, that our resolution is much, much lower. And you can see now our face count is down to just a little over 1,500 faces. So very, very significant reduction. So again, for most situations, I find that this auto cell size set to yes actually does a pretty good job. Now, one thing that you may notice as you're starting to work through some of your hybrido simulations and begin actually adding meshes around these, we may start to find that sometimes these hybrido meshes don't do a very good job of conforming to some of our more dramatic splashes. So in my case, if I were to go to something like frame 14, and once again, build my mesh, you can see where, again, this is doing a pretty good job of covering this surface, but we do start to get some of these more dramatic splashes where this particle, or rather this mesh, is just not doing a very good job of covering these particles. So in some situations, this may be a place where we can start to begin working on some of these different mesh options here. So once again, if I select my domain, by default we have our source set to the actual field itself, which really, if you think about this, this is just looking at just sort of an average of our grid data that's contained within this. So this from field gives us a very, very good, very fast mesh for most situations, but it sometimes doesn't capture all of the finer details of the particles themselves. So in that kind of a situation, we may want to switch this to particles. Now, in this case, if we were to come in here and rebuild this, you can start to see that in this case, what we start to get is really not very good. But what we can start to do to fix this is if we start to get some of these kinds of results with our from particles options, we can start by taking our detail threshold and actually start to bring that down. So I'll set this to something like 0, and once again, build my mesh. You can see in this case, this is now starting to do a little bit better job of capturing some of these little particles and some of these little finer details that are outside. So again, this is starting to get us on the right result. Now, what we may need to do is adjust our radius and our smoothness in order to fix this. So let's start by taking our radius, and let's see what happens if we were to take this from 0.1 up to 0.5. Let's once again rebuild this. Give this just a moment to calculate. And you can start to see that it does give us something that is very, very smooth, but in this case we've now lost almost all of that detail. So let's try taking this radius and bringing this back down, maybe something like 0.2. There we are, so that's now a little bit better. And now we can start to come in here and begin adjusting things like the actual smooth factor on this. So let's try bumping this up a little bit higher from 50 maybe to something like 70. And again, rebuild. And now you can start to see where that is getting now quite a bit closer to what we would actually expect, where now we can start to see some of these little finer details in the splashes. But at the same time, we now start to get a much improved sense of smoothness with this overall mesh. So really it's just kind of a matter of finding the right balance between this radius and the smoothness. Now sometimes, if we find that maybe the smoothness is a little bit too high and we're starting to, again, lose some of those details, what we may actually be able to do is start to introduce things like the relaxation back into this. So again, for this type of a resolution, this is actually looking pretty good. But if we go back to our actual grid mesh itself, and once again go to our filters, we'll turn on our relaxation and see if we can't use this to maybe improve our situation a little bit. So let's once again go in here and rebuild this. Alright, so in this case, not much of an improvement here, but what we can do is take our steps and start to increase this. We'll bump that up to something like 64. And once again, right click and rebuild. There we are. So once that's finished, again, we can start to see now a little bit better job of capturing some of this smaller, more intricate particle detail, but overall you can see our mesh is now very, very nice and smooth. Now one last option that we do have whenever it comes to actually building these grid-based meshes is we don't necessarily always have to have this big block of a mesh. So maybe if we wanted to simulate a surface that was maybe a nice big open body of water, what we could do is go back to our grid mesh, and right here where it says open boundaries, by default this is set to no, which again gives us sort of this block of a mesh. But if we set this to yes and then rebuild, what we should actually see is now just the actual top part of this mesh that gets generated. And you can see that that is exactly what we get. So now, again, this is going to be much better suited for just kind of a nice open body of water and not having a lot of unnecessary mesh and geometry in these areas where we probably won't even see them to begin with. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to come in and begin building out these meshes for our grid-based particles.